So we're now going to walk through part one of the implementation of the Backpressure aware RSocket Quote case study app on the server side. And we're going to focus particularly on the connection management portion. That's the part that's the Quotes Connect controller and the Quotes Connect service. And you can find this in the EX2 project in the RSocket folder in my live lessons GitHub repository. And here we are in that project. Notice we're in the main portion. And we come down here and we take a look at the server side. The actual microservice app is very, very simple. It's nothing unusual. It just creates a main entry point for the Quotes microservice. So that's nothing different than you've seen a million times before. Here's the Quotes Connect controller. We've looked at this before, so we won't spend a lot of time on it because that's not where the interesting stuff is happening. This basically just has an auto-wired Quotes Connect service, and it's got a connect mapping entry point, endpoint handler that is connected or is contacted when the client connects. And you can see it forwards to the service. The service, however, is somewhat interesting. So let's take a look at that. So here's the service. You can see it's got this hash map of connected clients, and it's got this handle connect method. And this method takes the identity of the client socket requester, or it takes the client socket requester that comes from the client, and it also takes the identity of the client. That comes across as something known as a payload. You'll see where the payload is set when we look at the client side in more detail. And it does two things. It handles client status changes, and it finalizes connection setup. So let's go take a look at finalize connection setup first. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take the client requester. This is the thing that was sent to us by the client. This is the RSocket requester the client sent us. And we're going to send it a message back. We're going to send a message back to the client, and we're going to send it the server response method, response message. That's the metadata. And we're going to put in that message the data that says connection accepted. So that tells the client, I, the server, have accepted your connection. And then we go ahead and we send that message to the client, and we get back a response. So we send it to the client, and the response that comes back is going to be the acknowledgement from the client saying, great, connection is now complete. This is basically a multi-way handshake that gets everything set up. So we print out what the client gives us back. And notice that we take this little mono pipeline and we use subscribe on it to set the wheels in motion. So this is now going to be running asynchronously in the background, doing all these kinds of things. Here is the handle client status changes method. That takes the client requester and the client identity, which is this UUID, which is a large random string. And it goes ahead and it ferrets out the RSocket that corresponds to the RSocket requester, which is really just kind of a wrapper around RSocket. And then it sets up a hook that'll do a bunch of things. And one of the things it does is it goes ahead and it subscribes, or it has a behavior that's triggered when the mono is first subscribed to, and that will go ahead and take the identity of the client and the client requester and put it in the connected client map. So we've recorded the fact that the client is with us. If at some point the client were to have an error that was unexpected, this method would get called back, and that says that we're closing down because we got an error. And then the final thing we do here, which will be triggered after an error occurs, is we go ahead and disconnect by removing the client from the client map. Or sorry, it's actually a client map. So we go ahead and remove that from the client map. And we also initiate all this processing asynchronously as well. So those two things are running in the background. This is going to run for a while until we shut down, until the client shuts down. The other one will run until we finish the three-way handshake with the client to establish the connection. There's also a helper method here called shutdown, which is marked as so-called pre-destroy. And what pre-destroy does is before Spring shuts down this controller, it'll go ahead and call this method once. It's kind of like a destructor. And that goes ahead and it iterates through all the connected clients, and for each client, it goes ahead and disposes it, which will free up the resources that were allocated. The other thing we need to talk about in the context of the Connect controller is how is security handled on the server side. So the way this is handled is by using this particular file, RSocket security config, which I've annotated to be RSocket security and reactive method security. So we've got some security mechanisms built in here. And this basically is going to enable the RSocket server to authenticate the client. Now, this is all done kind of under the hood. You don't actually have to do a lot of explicit things once you establish this particular file with these annotations. But basically, here's what we do. We have this message handler, and this will create it and configure it with the provided RSocket strategies. So we're going to set up this handler to do authentication. And then we've got this authentication bean. Notice these are all beans. So the authentication bean down here is the one that we're going to use in order to be able to know what types of user accounts we have registered here. And this is really just for educational purposes. You wouldn't typically do something quite like this because you don't want to be putting passwords into source code in the clear. You'd put this in a database with encryption and so on. But just to make this easy to explain, here's what we've got. We've got some users that are registered. We have a user and an admin. And I made myself one of the users. That's my username. And I made my password, some silly password, which is not my password, making a pun on the famous quote by Gandalf on the bridge at Khazad-dûm. And so I make myself a user. And then down here, we make an administrator. So these are basically just setting up these different kinds of user types. And then we go ahead and register them here so that they're registered. So when a client connects, it can check to see whether or not the client's credentials match what we've registered here. And there's similarly an authentication thing where it goes ahead and under the hood, using the magic of annotations and interceptors and so on, it's going to go ahead and take a look at the incoming requests to check to see whether they're authenticated or not. So very simple security, not necessarily production quality, but at least it gives you a sense of what happens. If you do not have a user with the right credentials and you've set up the security policies, as we've seen here, then Spring will not let your client connect to the server. And that's all kind of handled under the hood. You don't really see that per se. It just comes back with an error on the client side saying it didn't pass the authentication test. So that's basically the connection management portion of stuff. There's a couple other things here that I just will mention in passing. There's a constants file that has the strings that we use for all this stuff. And you can see that it's got constants for zippy quotes and handy quotes and the port number that the server's listening on and stuff. So that's just there to be aware of because it's used throughout both the client and the server.